This morning, I want to offer you a sermon on what might seem like an unusual subject, Frankenstein. Churches and religious communities typically take Scripture as a starting point for their sermons. Many demand a neat dividing line between the sacred and the secular. One set of works, holy books, theological treatises, spiritual autobiographies, liturgical poetry, are appropriate for Sunday morning. Another set of works, romance novels, science fiction stories, tales of the fantastic and phantasmological are decidedly not. In some instances, religious communities even denounce secular works, which has certainly been true in the case of Frankenstein. Ever since it was published, some critics have claimed that it was anti-Christian, for daring to consider the possibility that humanity might intrude upon God's domain and author life. Shortly after it appeared, one influential reviewer described it as horrible and disgusting, and raised the question of whether the head or the heart of the author was more diseased. You'll experience no such criticism from this pulpit, in part because, as I will explain, Frankenstein has close connections to English Unitarianism, but more broadly, because Unitarian Universalism makes no clear distinction between the sacred and the secular. We need no look further than the Unitarian Universalist Association's sources to find urgings that we examine science and other kinds of supposedly secular knowledge for religious inspiration. In truth, one of the distinguishing marks of our tradition since its inception has been that its proponents have claimed that religious practice and belief have many of their roots in things that we might call secular. 19th century Unitarianism was despised by its opponents for going so far as to dare to claim that the Christian New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, in fact, had been authored by the secular nature of human hands rather than divinely gifted by God. The refusal to divide the secular and the sacred is the reason why last week in our series on reimagining grief, we turned to the dance band LCD Sound System's anthem, "I'm Losing My Edge," for inspiration. It's the reason why this week we delve into Frankenstein, a work of imagination profoundly influenced by its author's grief and devoted to the project of reimagining grief. The story you probably know. Mad scientist creates creature. With an unsavory assistant, he raids graveyards, cuts executed murderers down from the gallows, and constructs a ghoulish body for a vital force. He then animates with electricity before shouting, "It's alive." His creation subsequently goes on a rampage, kills children, terrorizes the good found folks, experiences brief moments of transcendence, grasping the beauty of flowers or the brilliance of music. It experiences revulsion when it glimpses its own gruesome visage. It panics at the heat and sight of fire. Ultimately, it is destroyed, depending on the version, by its own hand, by an angry mob, or by its creator. It's alive. Ever since Shelley's novel was released in 1818, the story has been variously interpreted and told. The 1970s version by Mel Brooks contains a hilarious rendition of the monster dancing to "Puttin' on the Ritz." The more, perhaps, iconic 1931 version has the mad scientist conducting his experiments in the most Gothic of European castles. In the original novel, though, he builds his creature while a student in something akin to his dorm room. In either case, the story is often told as a parable about the dangers of technology, The mad scientist, usually named Victor Frankenstein, builds the creature without regard to the consequences he might face. It's alive. It's not uncommon in interpretations of Frankenstein to consider it a warning about the folly of humans who dare to challenge the divine prerogative. In one film, the creature first stirs. Frankenstein looks to the heavens and shouts, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." This morning, we will primarily turn our attention to Mary Shelley's original text. Like scriptural stories and parables, its many variations are suggestive of its power to, by turns, delight, inspire, scare, provoke, and cause us to think profoundly about the meaning of life and death. We're reading it in my ministerial book group, and if you've not read it, I really suggest that you do so. It's well worth a gander. Shelley's text reflects the grief that filled her life. Her mother, the philosopher and writer Mary Wollstonecraft, died 10 days after she was born. Shelley's own infant girl died shortly before she wrote Frankenstein. She grieved the absence of them both. In her dreams, the dead returned to life. In her diary, she recorded sleeping and finding my little baby had come to life again, only to awake and find no baby. It should not, perhaps, be surprising that her novel is populated with the beloved dead. It is the death of Victor Frankenstein's mother that appears to spur him in his scientific pursuits. Over the course of the novel, everyone he knows dies. His young siblings, his father, his wife, his best friend, his wife's best friend. In most cases, they're murdered by his creation, but that's not always what happens. One dies of grief, and another after being accused of a murder that she did not commit. Such tragedy-filled lives were common in Shelley's days. In addition to her mother, one of her sisters predeceased her. Of her 4 children, only one lived into adulthood. Her husband, the famed poet Percy Shelley, died a few years after Frankenstein was written. Grief for her must have been ever present. Certainly, ever since she was self-aware, she keenly felt the absence of her mother. Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the most important philosophers of what became known, or what has become known, as feminism. And it was through her that Shelley connected with Unitarianism. Wollstonecraft was a member of the Unitarian Church in Newington Green in London. While it is possible to overstate the influence on Unitarianism on her life and thought, she was closely connected to the congregation's minister, Richard Price, until he died. Afterwards, she remained active in Unitarian circles, even if she did not attend services. Wollstonecraft's most famous work was her treatise, A Vindication on the Rights of Women. Published in 1792, in the middle of the French Revolution, it blasted 18th century gender norms as debasing for keeping women in a state of listless activity and stupid acquiescence. Rejecting the ideal that women were weak, irrational, and needed to be kept in a state of childhood, she argued that all humans, regardless of gender, are equally rational and deserve equal access to education and should be granted equal political rights. These were incredibly radical ideas in 18th century England. They appear even to be somewhat radical ideas in 21st century Texas. We live, after all, in a state where, and at a time where the legislature has passed laws regulating the bodies and reproductive rights of women, but not those of men. We live in a moment when such legislation is passed by a political party and a political body whose representatives are overwhelmingly male. It's not hard to wonder that if Senate Bill 8 would have been authored if there was equal representation of genders in the legislature. But I digress. Wollstonecraft died shortly after giving birth to Mary Shelley. Shelley grew up with her memory ever present. Her mother's portrait had pride of place in her father's study. And as she learned to read and grow older, she voraciously devoured and then returned to again and again all of her mother's texts. Last week, I shared with you the anthropologist David Graeber's observation, rarely do the political careers of important individuals end in death. Ancestors can be far more important after their death than when they were alive. Graeber continues his observation with the claim, mourning then could be seen the part of the essential labor of people-making. What he means here is that we humans raise and shape each other, and that we lift up people in death to serve as models, inspirations, and moral exemplars as we continue living. Recognizing that the dead continue to shape the living is part of our work of reimagining grieving. Certainly, to coming to understand that the dead are ever present in shaping my own life through both the stories that I tell and the stories that I've had told to me has been one of the ways I've lived my own grief over the years. What about you? Cornelius Eady writes beautifully about his ongoing relationship with his dead father in his magnificent cycle of poems, You Don't Miss Your Water. In it, he describes the conversations he has with his deceased dad. Even though his father's body has been reduced to an empty chair, he can easily imagine them talking and what they would say to each other. He can imagine the advice his father would give. The inquiry, just for safety's sake, if my wife still had her good-paying job. And he can imagine sharing something of his success, his life with the old fool. Have you had similar conversations? Where you find yourself in dialogue with those you've loved even after they're dead? For me, the dead have continued to have a present even if I've never really known them. My grandfather Maury died when I was a toddler. I have no memory of him, and yet he has played a significant role and continues to play a significant role in my life and the life of my family. I grew up listening to stories about him. One in particular that my father really enjoyed was about my grandfather's love of bacon. Now, you might know that my grandfather was a somewhat observant Jew. He mostly kept a kosher household. Yet at some point in his life, he had discovered a love for bacon. Whenever confronted about the fact that this was apparently not kosher, he would deny that bacon was in any way related to pigs or pork. Maury, isn't bacon pork? Doesn't it come from pigs? People are supposed to have asked him. No, it's just bacon, was the alleged reply. Now, I could offer an entire sermon reflecting on how that story has influenced my life. And I could probably write a dozen more on the various stories I've heard about my grandfather. The larger point, however, is this. The dead are ever with us, whether we knew them or not. Has this been your experience? It's been mine, and such experiences closely hew to the larger hope of this sermon series, and indeed much of my preaching. Through our work of reimagining grief, I want to lift up the truth that it is our connections to each other that make us human. We humans are social creatures. The radical individualism so prevalent in our society is a myth. There is no me without you. We come to know ourselves through each other. Our successes and failures have as much to do with the larger social structures we collectively create and maintain as they do with our own strivings. Almost everything we have, almost everything we do is created and performed within relationship to each other. Art, science, even something as deceptively simple as cooking a meal is ultimately a collective, a social act. When I make dinner tonight, I will be reliant on the labor of thousands. Though I might chop the onions, saute the garlic, or make the salad dressing alone, in all I do, I will be dependent upon the farmers who grew the food, the laborers who harvested it, the truck drivers who shipped it, and the grocery store workers who sold it. My dependence will not even end there. I'll be connected to the miners who mined the iron ore that was crafted into pots and knives, the factory workers who built the stove on which I cook, and the builders who created the house in which I live. The list of connections that can be discovered in the simple act of cooking is infinite. And considering it reveals the simple truth. We are all connected to each other and need each other to survive. This was something that was understood by the Unitarians of the 18th and 19th centuries. They frequently preached on interdependence. They claimed that humans were created in the likeness of God, and that it was through our religious communities and our connections to each other that we could grow in such likeness. The purpose of the church and the religious communion in their hearts was to empower each of us to become more virtuous people and uncover the threads that bind each to all. They even held views on death and grief similar to those that we've been put forth in this sermon series. In considering the nature of the religious community and institutions they quoted with great satisfaction the philosopher Edmund Burke when he argued society is a partnership not only between those who are living, but with those who are dead and those who are to be born. And they claimed in their gendered language, the relationships between man and men cease not with life. We are most intimately connected with the dead by 1,000 dependencies. We are shaped by our relationships with the living and the dead. We're social creatures, not atomized individuals. Like her mother and like the Unitarians of her day, Mary Shelley believed humans to be deeply social. It's quite possible to read her Frankenstein as a parable about humanity's social nature. Consider the story she tells. Victor Frankenstein is happy and well-adjusted while he is surrounded by family and friends. After his mother dies, he travels to the university where he finds himself lost in the most melancholy reflection and alone, away from amiable companionship. It is in and from his loneliness that Frankenstein creates the creature. He seeks to break the bonds of life and death and pour a torrent of light into our dark world through the construction of a new species. These new beings would, in his words, bless me as its creator and source. Never would he be alone anymore. He is alone when he is successful with his experiment. Alone when he shouts, "It's alive," although the phrase actually never appears in the original novel. Alone when the creature stirs in his laboratory. Alone when he then flees his laboratory, overcome at the catastrophe he has created. Soon, he's reunited with his family and friends and discovers himself to be loving and beloved by all, and wholly uninterested in continuing with his gruesome experiments. Meanwhile, rejected by his father, the creature is never given a name, but he is given a gender. Frankenstein's creation wanders until such a time as it finds a secluded place from where he can observe and learn from a human family. Watching them, he learns language, learns to love, learns that we human beings become with each other. Over and over, he struggles with the realization, I am alone. Over and over, he longs for acceptance, connection, the desire to be known and to know. The more I saw of them, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness, the creature confesses about the family he monitored. He hopes to find connection, but only experiences rejection. He reveals himself to the family, but does not inspire love, instead inspiring fear. They flee from his sight. He gets no love. And it is then becomes monstrous and begins his work of killing. If I cannot inspire fear, if I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, the creature warns its creator when they meet. The tragedies that fill the book are all the result of isolation and rejection that the creature experiences. He demands that Frankenstein create for him a companion, an Eve with whom he might live. He promises his creator, the love of another will destroy the cause of my crimes. Frankenstein at first assents. Later, fearful of what he might unleash upon humanity, he destroys the bride for his creature before she even comes to consciousness. It is only when the creature faces the possibility of eternal loneliness, of never encountering another like him, that he vows revenge upon his creator. He sets about to kill all who Victor Frankenstein loves. He is successful. With each death that Victor Frankenstein experiences, he falls further into madness, becomes less and less capable of living a life among his human fellows or contributing to the larger good. Eventually, after experiencing the death of both his wife and father, he finds himself alone and obsessed, not with creating life, but with destroying it. He chases his creature throughout the world and dies before being successful in his mission. In the end, it is the creature that mourns his creator. In his closing soliloquy, he emphasizes that it was his inability to find connection that caused him to do all the ill he wrought. Still I desired love and fellowship, and I was still spurned. Am I to be thought the only criminal when all of humankind sinned against me? The story is in the end a morality play about the terrible things that can come from the grief of loneliness. In our work of reimagining grief, we might consider how grief comes from a loss of connection and how much more good might be brought into the world by maintaining a connection with each other. Certainly the message of Frankenstein, and it is a message for today. For Shelley wants us to understand that grief can only be overcome by our connections with each other. When our loved ones die, we can lose the worst parts of ourselves by losing connections with the living, or we can seek further connection and live further into life. It would be easy here to argue that this makes Frankenstein the perfect story for our times, a time when people find themselves more alone than ever. However, rather than resting on that point, let me instead suggest that it offers us a purpose for our religious community. It's the same purpose that the Unitarians of Shelley's day had for theirs. It is for us to offer each other connection and fellowship, and in doing so, inspire each other to grow in compassion, love, and beauty. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.